the Lord's Supper on the board, but man, it's got that feel of the Lord's Supper to it, doesn't it?
Amen.
Just like when the pagan sailors were converted on the ship of Jonah, and they offered sacrifices to the Lord with thanksgiving after the storm had been calm when they threw Jonah overboard. As a side note, the guitarist for U2, The Edge, has a t-shirt. It's got a Jonah reference on it. And when you look it up, in some of the movies or whatever, concerts, and when you look it up, it's like, and they threw Jonah overboard and the storm was still. That's a picture of the cross. It preaches the gospel. God's wrath was put on Jesus instead of on us. He was sacrificed so that the storm of God's wrath would completely pass over us. So, let's keep going. Then, verse 36, this was an act of courage of these people with him. Then they were all encouraged and also took food themselves. And in all, we were 276 persons on the ship. So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. Man, we are all in. All in. Watch poker movies or whatever. James Bond, not officially. I'm all in. All your chips are there. All my wheat is overboard. I ain't got nothing but God now. There's no food left. I'm either going to die on the way to where I'm going or I'm going to get there, but it ain't going to be by any more food because the food is overboard. God is stripping away everything but himself for these men. Keep going. Verse 39. By the way, it ends at 44, so just know we're hang in. When it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach onto which they planned to run the ship if possible. And they let go the anchors and left them in the sea, meanwhile loosing the rudder ropes, and they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore. But striking a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. At this particular location, there was like sand on the top, but then this really strong clay underneath in this particular location. And so what happened was, they thought they were doing the right thing, but they didn't know that this was where these two waters met, and it made it where they got, the front of the boat got jammed into this strong clay underneath the water. And so it was stuck. And then the waves were beating to the back of the boat, and the waves were like claws tearing at the back of the boat, and they're that's what was happening. And here's something amazing, I think. Look at this verse 41. This tiny little phrase, they ran the ship aground. There's been a lot of ink spilled over this one tiny little phrase in the Bible. And I want to tell you why. In the Greek, the language, the verb that is used, there's different, it's one form in the critical text, the other form in the majority text. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. But still, this verb, the form, the general family of verbs is something that's repeated often in the Odyssey. But even more important, the word here, noun, where we get nautical, and through the Latin we get the word navy, that word for ship is used nowhere else in the entire New Testament. That word for ship is never used by Luke elsewhere in the book of Acts at all. He uses the word ploion or ploia for boat or ship. This one little Greek word was the word used throughout the Odyssey. And I want to read to you, I want you to hang in because it's worth it. I want to read to you a couple comments about this one little tiny part of the book of Acts. And I hope you'll see why it's worth it. Let's see. It says this from this one commentary. It is also remarkable that the word noun is used only here in Acts, which always has the ordinary Hellenistic word ploion, Blast's suggestion that there is a conscious reminiscence of Homer in this collocation of two unused words is very attractive. F. Bruce says this: this is the only New Testament occurrence of classical nous. That word is an old word that comes straight out of Homer, that's not used anywhere else in the Bible, which has been ascribed here to a Homeric reference. I just want to read to you a couple passages. Actually, I'm not going to do that, but I've got them here if you want to look at them later on. These two verbs, the family of verb for the beaching the ship, and then that name for ship, is used in several places in the Odyssey. And so again, you don't have to agree that Luke was consciously kind of, still describing historical events, but consciously putting it, using that word to go, hey guys, God is the Lord of history. Paul is sort of like Odysseus, only everyone on the ship would be saved instead of destroyed. And this is actually true. Whether you accept that or not, I hope you see the big pattern here. I hope I've convinced you of how God has ordained these events. God could have just put Paul by land, some sea voyage, but the normal way on land to go to Rome. But God sovereignly put Paul through an Odyssean journey as he was bringing the kingdom to the center, one of the great centers of the Gentile world. That's what God was doing. It's beautiful. Look at verse 42. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners. Like, what? Lest any of them should swim away and escape. This was actually a reasonable thing for unbelievers to think. They could be killed if they let the soldiers go. They were responsible for these. If they let the prisoners go, they were responsible. So they were in fear for their lives, that they might escape. Verse 43, but when the centurion, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest some on boards and some on parts of the ship, and so it was that they all escaped safely to land. In the Odyssey, Odysseus said, all my men were lost, but then Zeus, brought to me part of the mast that I floated safely on to shore. But in history, the true Lord had it work out where the exact number of people who were able to swim jumped overboard and got to land. And again, for Paul's sake, they were saved. God gave Paul favor in the eyes of this Roman official, Julius, the centurion. And to save Paul, he saved all of them. So the exact number of people who had the ability to swim, not all could, jumped in the water and swam to land. And then not only was there just one little piece of mast, but there were enough chunks of the boat that the rest of the 276 people who couldn't swim would float on to shore. Look at our God. Isn't this beautiful? Yes. That's our God. He's so detailed. And this is his literary providence. This is not just a journalistic description of certain events. This has literary features to it. Parallelism. It's because history is God's literature pointing to King Jesus. Why should it surprise us to learn that when the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem in 70 AD, it was destroyed on the very same Jewish calendar day as it was destroyed hundreds of years earlier by the Babylonians? Josephus tells us that. The same calendar day. History has meaning because it has an author. God's literary providence perplexes unbelief. It has to be story or history. It can't be both because there's no author to history. There could be no coincidences that strong. It has to be plagiarized. It has to be made up. No, it doesn't. Because all of history is God's literature. There is an author to every event in life. God hates sin. He's not the direct author of sin, but he ordained it and it's part of the story and he's using it for his glory to point to King Jesus. It also is no coincidence that the very hour that Jesus spoke about over and over throughout the Gospel of John, my hour is not yet come, my hour is not yet come. They couldn't get a hold of him to get him because his hour had not yet come. But that very hour upon which Jesus would be handed over to be crucified eventually was on the day of Passover, that the lambs were given over to be killed. History has meaning. History is God's literature that points to a king so loving that he would be willing to be crucified for those who hated him and even for those who killed him. That is our king. That is our God. And God is saying to you through history and through this story, look at King Jesus. Be reconciled to King Jesus. Remember that Jesus is your king over your life and all of your Odyssean journeys. And his promises are faithful. Above all, that great promise upon which we depend in our daily lives, what? It is finished. Amen.